Okay, we are in business. Hopefully a few more folks will join us, but do you know, Moises, from the youth subcommittee perspective, who we're expecting today? Or just our typical, like Madar and Dati and those? Okay.
Hopefully.
Yeah, I haven't heard from anybody directly that they couldn't make it. So nobody reached out to me today. So with that, I think we'll just get started. Cindy, would you mind grabbing our agenda and pulling it up?
Absolutely.
You have it so we can go through it.
I do. Thank you. I was trying to get it to Zoom correctly.
I was looking, thank you, Cindy, she uploads all of these to YouTube for those who are interested to see them, just so Pam, our guest, knows that you will be uploaded to the Salt Lake City YouTube, because these are all transparent and open to the public. And I went to look there because we're doing some outreach for the upcoming listening sessions, and I wanted to grab that link. And I'm appreciative that we record these in gallery view as opposed to speaker view, because my poor fellow facilitator, Josh, is up on there with a not great look on his face. Like, you know how they freeze one frame of the YouTube video to sort of show as the icon. Oh geez, glad we record these in gallery view. Okay, thank you, Cindy. Okay, so we're doing the very first one. I'm welcoming you, welcome everybody, and doing the agenda review. So today we do have some answers that were provided by the PD. Did you all receive those? I think that Coletta sent them out end of last week. And if you didn't, I will just pull them up out of my email and we can go through them together. And then if you didn't receive them directly, I'll make sure that they get forwarded to you. I believe there were only 2 or 3, so it shouldn't take us too long to go through. And then we have Pam Vickery here with us today to provide information on the juvenile justice system, some of the things we've been talking about over recent weeks, where we just have some gaps in our data that we wanted to have her come and help us fill in. And then we have been scheduling the interviews, and I appreciate those of you who've been responsive to Coletta in getting those different interview times set up. And Cindy, I'm not sure if you have the latest on that. I think she put it on the Google Drive. If you don't mind, like kind of looking around for that link for when we're ready to discuss that. We don't need to do it now, but
Okay.
just for when we are ready to jump to that, and then discuss our next steps and set our next agenda. So that is what we should do today. And Pam, I know you're being very generous with your time, but I suspect that our conversation around the juvenile justice system will take the majority of our time today, and I hope that it does. So I was just going to run through the latest answers that we got from the PD before we jump to you, so that that may actually provide a good segue to what you're planning to share with us today. So let me go back to Coletta's email.
I do have that email if you want me to share that.
Yes, thank you, Cindy, for being so magical and faster than I.
Okay.
If you can pull that up so we can take a look.
Are you seeing it now?
No, I was still seeing the agenda.
Sorry.
So you just need to unshare and then reshare.
Thank you.
There we go. Okay. So we did get the SRO. These are things that Cindy had highlighted from our meeting notes that required some follow-up. So updated data, we have 2013 to 2019, and if there's any changes that may be visible in that data. So this information is included in the attached report, and it looks like that now goes to November of 2020. So we have, I guess from 2019 to 2020, it was extended just a tiny bit. And then due to COVID, schools were shut down most of 2020. So the SRO spent most of their time during 2020 assisting the school district with food distribution and contacting students that needed assistance. There are no arrest or citations given in the schools, which makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and it does look like this went out to everybody based on what I'm seeing in the 2 lines. So on the 4th, Friday the 4th. So if you want to scoot back, and if you're interested in these attachments, you should have it in your own. So lest you feel like they're just dangling out there for you not to be able to see, you should have them. And then related to the MOU between the PD and the school district, we wanted to see if those quarterly meetings had been occurring. The most recent MOU is attached. Sergeant Tierlink is in contact with school district officials on a weekly basis, sometimes several times a day, but due to COVID, the school and police meetings have not taken place. There's a meeting scheduled for the 15th. So I know that when we get to scheduling the interviews, when we get to talking about that, maybe we can talk about digging a little deeper when we get to those interviews to understand, because if it's that frequent and that informal, that's great, but I wonder what accountability that provides, because the intent that I understand in the MOU, and you can all tell me if I'm reading it incorrectly, but the way I understand that those quarterly meetings are meant to be the accountability for the program, or to measure that efficacy. So while I am all for more frequent check-ins, I wonder what that does to the kind of official accountability part of those discussions. So I'd be interested to learn more from Sergeant Tierlink. Can we scoot down just a tiny bit more to the next one, Cindy? So I can see the answer under the next bullet. Thank you. Related to the Latino population, and if the information is provided. It's included in the attached report entitled Updated Juvenile Justice Citations. But race, but not ethnicity. The school district reported they do not keep track of arrested, cited students and get their stats from the police department. I'm not sure I understand that. That it's included the race, but not ethnicity. The police department tracks, and the school district reported that they don't keep track. I guess what I'm reading there is that they rely on the police department solely to keep that data, and that they are not keeping any data independent from the school or from the police department. So I guess, do we want to actually look at the updated data document, or do you want to do that on your own time? No, not right now.
And there's an updated one than the one they sent us?
Well, the one they sent us originally, I believe, ended in 2019, and we asked if there was something more recent, and this one here has an end date of November 2020.
Okay.
So it must have
The new one
updated,
also
but
has some racial makeup. It's kind of separated there, so it also has that to look at.
so it has
Does it have
additional.
ethnicity? It has ethnicity, Nicole?
Yes.
Okay, so do you want to put that on the agenda for next time to sort of, or do we want to assign someone to sort of dig into it a little bit between meetings and come back to us with some thoughts at the next meeting on whether that new breakdown is going to be more effective, in our opinion, going forward?
I think a couple of us could look at it, and then we'll just discuss it next week.
Okay, sounds good. I heard that as a volunteer from Moises to do it. Anybody else want to read it? Rogelio, do you want to read it, since it sounds like you've already kind of dug into it a bit?
Yeah, I can look into it more.
Okay, just as I think if I'm understanding from previous conversations, we really wanted to be able to parse that Latino data very specifically because it hadn't been provided in much detail, which we thought probably wasn't showing the disparity to the degree that it actually exists, because that information wasn't being provided. So with that lens in mind, if you two don't mind digging into it, I will also do so. With that, is there anything else off the top that anybody wants to bring to the group before we jump to our wonderful and generous guest speaker, Pam, who's here to talk to us about some of the questions we had on juvenile justice? And to intro this a tiny bit, and I'll let her introduce herself, but just the context that I gave her is where we are in this conversation is that we've mostly done a lot of our background homework, but that we've identified some gaps in this data and some perceived difference between what the documents set out for the program and what's actually happening as those referrals are going to justice court and what's actually playing out there and what disparities maybe she's seeing would be something of interest for us, for this group. I also forwarded her the questions that we came up with last time that we're using for our interviews, just to give her a little context about where we are as a group. And then she forwarded us her memo generously that she had already written in. Pam, for just so you know, I think I copied you on it, but I forwarded it to this group for their information. So with that, I don't know if Nicole, if you want to introduce Pam, or if Pam, if you want to introduce yourself and give us a little background about what you do.
I'm happy to introduce myself. Hi, Nicole. It's great to see you. Well, as Nicole and Mo know, I do not come prepared with PowerPoints. I basically just ramble till you guys tell me where you want me to go. So my name is Pam Vickery, and I'm the Executive Director of Utah Juvenile Defender Attorneys. So my office has the contract with Salt Lake County to represent all kids who come to court in Salt Lake County with delinquency allegations. But we are also very involved in policy issues. I spent almost 18 years on the Utah Board of Juvenile Justice. I'm the chair of this, currently the chair of the Sentencing Commission. And I was involved in the working group that the governor put together that developed the recommendations for juvenile justice reform stuff in 2017, and then worked with that. And now I'm currently on the implementation committee. It's called the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee, which is charged with seeing the implementation of juvenile justice reform issues under the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice. So that's how I've continued to be involved in this issue. I think that Siobhan has talked to you, and I know Nicole has as well, that we've seen a ton of really great successes from juvenile justice reform. We've actually seen a significant decrease in the number of kids that are in out of home placements. The number of kids in detention beds is down huge, like from hundreds in previous years to less than 50 statewide. Some of that right now is also driven by COVID, but it was dropping dramatically even before that. COVID pushed that needle a little further. We're hoping that that continues to be something that the courts and other people continue to look at, because it really kind of pointed out how much do we need to be detaining before a court hearing and things like that. So we've seen a lot of really great successes with things like that. And I know that you guys are going to be looking to talk with Donovan Bergstrom from Juvenile Justice Services, who is an incredible resource, and they can talk about how they've shut down detention facilities and converted them into community spaces for kids to get referred and families to come in for resources. And unlike the adult system that has had trouble quantifying the actual saved dollars, the juvenile justice system created a marked fund to gather the saved dollars, and those dollars have to be used for non-residential placements going forward. And we've seen, I think, and again, JJS can talk to this, but so far, like in excess of $9 million in savings in a 3-year period. So the juvenile justice system has had some real successes. And then we've had some real struggles. Obviously, one of the goals of juvenile justice reform was to address the fact that we knew we had red issues already within our system, right? That we had an overrepresentation of kids of color from the very beginning, and that number got increasingly more disparate as you got further and further into the system. Since reform, that number has not improved. And in fact, in some ways, it's gotten worse. So we're looking at a lot of different things that we need to continue to address overall as a system. But one of the things that is always the issue that continues is how do we look at how we're interacting with our young people in the school setting to make sure that we're not doing anything to continue to perpetuate that referral and the overuse of the criminal justice system, and making a clear delineation between what is school-based behavior and what is actually like court referral type behavior. And then of course that also raises the issue of red issues within that capacity as well. So as Siobhan said, I would love to take credit for that beautifully drafted memo, but Monica Mayo and Marina Pena from my office did it. And they are brilliant, and we are happy to do any follow-up research for you guys if it's helpful. But at the time, we were putting this together for a group working with under the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee about what should the approach be with regards to school resource officers. Clearly, there are issues that have been identified nationally. And I think one of the things that's really important to look at with this is that it's like anything, right? Like nobody's placing blame anywhere with any of these things. What we're really just trying to do is say that we have seen issues and we have seen trends. And so how best should we address that? And clearly we know that there has been a problem with the school to prison pipeline issue. And then obviously, as you saw in the memo that we sent, there is clearly, when you have school resource officers, the reality is that there just is a higher rate of referral for kids of color than there is for white kids. And so, should that be addressed through enhancing the training or continuing to just work with ongoing training that Mo and Chief Angela Weirden have developed and have so generously gone around and worked with schools to enhance relationships between school administrators and school resource officers. So that particular group was looking at the time about school resource officers. And part of that was driven also by the Libertas Institute had done a poll, and it showed of Utah, they had hired an independent polling company. And the poll came back to say that 60% of Utahns would like to see SROs out of schools. And that's just the poll that was done by an independent, like I said, polling company through Libertas. But some of what we talked about in the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee meeting was, are there also some of these positives that you see? And there's been a real change over the years between SROs and school administration through the training and stuff like that that's been developed. That particular group was looking at Representative Holland's bill, which is this guides the training for school resource officers, really looking at saying, it was already mandatory that you had to have an MOU, but should certain aspects of the training be mandatory? And then also, should the data collection piece of it be mandatory? And there's two pieces of this, right? You have Representative Holland's legislation, which I know Mo can speak to. And then you have also from several years ago, Senator Andrade passed some legislation that talks about that schools that have school resource officers should be required to capture certain types and pieces of data. And that hasn't happened. And so was it just last year? I'm trying to remember. Anyway, it did an extension on that. And so now they have until 2023 to make that effective. So what we were looking at with the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee is, should we go as far as looking at, should we not have school resource officers? Should we tailor Representative Holland's training legislation? Should we look at Senator Andrade's stuff? And so kind of where we're looking right now and hoping to go is to tie Representative Holland's legislation to saying, if you really want an SRO, then the school as well as the law enforcement agency have to work together, and the data has to be collected, right? This legislation has been in place since, I think it was passed in 2017, and none of the data elements have been put in place yet. And so you guys are seeing some of that, right? And I think you just referenced this, is that I was really interested to see what Salt Lake City PD had in terms of referrals, which was really interesting. But some of what we really want to be capturing with this is, what are the points of contact in the school pre-citation, right? Because a lot of what's being talked about is the positives that an SRO can have. And I'm not disputing that, but the question is how do you quantify that and make sure that is happening across the board for all students? Or is that some people's experiences, right? Because that's what's really important, is how people are perceiving the resources that are there for them. So I think I would really encourage you guys to look at Senator Andrade's legislation and identifying some of the data points with regards to that, and see if those are some of the things also, and whether or not Salt Lake City schools have put in place being able to document some of that. And I can send you on the links for that particular bill. It was originally SB 166 and then it was SB 198, but you've got to have the years with it. So I can send that. And then also just in reference to how things are going, particularly with as a general rule, how we're seeing things. What we have seen, if you go to the House Bill 239, they have an annual report every year, which is found on the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice's website. And the annual report for 2019 is out, and it can show you the number of school referrals. Now, you have to be careful with the school referrals because it doesn't delineate what we haven't figured out. I shouldn't say it doesn't delineate. What we're not clear yet is, are the school referrals that we're looking at in that data, are they school referrals based on an interaction from an SRO, or a straight referral from the school to court, or a referral based on the fact that the school contacts outside law enforcement and comes in? And so we're still trying to figure out that particular piece of information. And so that's important to be able to know that that data is not really available. But what we do see is that there actually in 2019 statewide, there was 3,687 school referrals. So essentially referrals to the court that started from school-based behavior.
Can you say that number again?
3,687.
Wow, okay.
So I think the question when I start to look at this is looking at school referrals and based on like the populations of different districts and things like that. And kind of, if we're looking at that statewide, you know, I don't know what percentage, you know, and in Salt Lake County, we've got a huge number of school districts. So, but I think that is what's interesting about that number is it's actually up 66% since 2015. But and I have to read my note on this because I'm not a data person, so I won't be able to tell you correctly. That is also based on the fact it's somewhat inflated, or is inflated, because of the court changed the way that they were capturing data to get specifically at what I was just kind of explaining, really looking at school-based delineation between what was a school-based referral versus what was school-based offense versus a general referral. So they changed the way that they were classifying that. So I think that they're starting to capture better and more accurately the numbers. So it's hard to really be able to compare it to the 2015 number because that number may not be reflective, I guess is my point. But I still think that the statewide number is an important number, and one for us like to really consider and think about when you're looking at the issue as a whole. Let's see, I'm going back to the other things that we were talking about. One of the things that, another thing to think about is I saw that there was some, in looking through your guys' information, there was some references to gang and group enhancements and things like that. So the way that the referral system works is this, is that obviously Class C misdemeanors, status offenses and Class C misdemeanors are not, that happen on school property, are not referable to law enforcement. Okay, put that in a box over there. And that's another thing though that I think is an interesting segue, is I think it's fascinating that the number is 3,600, and that's after we've removed truancy from that, because in 2017, well, pre-2017, when we were looking at juvenile justice reform, the number one most common referral to the juvenile court system was truancy. So we've removed a huge percentage of things from that were school-based type things, and then we still have a school referral number of 3,600. And I saw from your guys' breakdown, there's a wide range of what that is, right? Trespass up to like distribution, and there was some felony stuff on there as well. So no one's disputing that there is not behavior that needs to be addressed at schools sometimes versus that is court-based versus school-based. So anyway, when the school has a problem that they see, and you have an SRO there, the SRO actually then has the ability to make the determination about whether or not they want to refer it to court or whether or not they want to use an evidence-based alternative. So they actually have the ability to say, to look at a situation and say, this is an assault, but I'm going to work with the school, and the school has an appropriate evidence-based alternative that would be helpful for this particular young person or whatever. And so the law enforcement, and that's in, oh, sorry.
I'm gonna pause you there for a second. So we were talking last week that the administrator has the first point of decision. Is that right? By your, like, they can decide whether to involve the SRO or not involve the SRO. That came from the MOU. Is that right?
Yeah, yes, that is the, it's the, I guess it's the way you're looking at how you've crafted your MOUs, but yes, an MOU can say that and that's always been the
In Salt Lake
situation, right? I
City.
mean, right, like your number one point is a school can decide, do you or do you not want an SRO? And then step number two is when and in what circumstances and how well have you been able to define in your MOU, when will administration or teachers include the SRO? But
then once it gets to the SRO, that's what you're talking about. They also have a decision point whether it's handled criminally or still keeping it in with internal process. Okay, thank you. I just
right, which I thought was so interesting about your guys's PowerPoint on some of the things that you're looking at doing is really kind of trying to tailor clear responses about like what should be handled what, and then across your guys's.
That came from PD.
Oh, okay. So I thought that was really interesting to try and make it like consistent across the board as well. So but yes, but then what happens is, and this is something that was in your guys' questionnaire too, is once it gets referred, the district attorney doesn't decide whether or not it'll go through what is called the non-judicial process. A misdemeanor offense goes directly to the probation department, which is under the courts, the juvenile probation department. The juvenile probation department then meets with the young person and they do what's called a PRA, a pre-screening assessment. And if they're low, then they shall be offered a non-judicial adjustment. So it's required, assuming that they don't have more than 5 previous offenses so there's some nuances
so is
there.
Assessment, is it like yes, no, like a quiz in a magazine? If you get like the certain number threshold, then it goes this direction. If you get the other number threshold, you go.
Yeah, so there's two. There's the PSRA, which is the short one, which is the first one that they do. And I think it only has like 8 or 9 questions on it. It's shorter and it determines low or high risk. Now, I will say that is one of the things that's always also being looked at by the courts is that one of the drivers that's creating our red issues, right? Because our people, and one of the things that was my major point with that is there was a question on the PSRA that kind of referenced gang activity, and it didn't actually, they had changed the wording on it, but it referenced, no, it actually references gang activity. And so that's something that I think folks are looking at to say, because in my experience, I've never had a client who doesn't think he's gang involved. They all think they're gang involved. So when they're getting interviewed, if the kids, you say, are you gang involved? And they're like, oh yeah, and as Mo and I have talked a lot of times, there's a real difference on the kid spectrum of gang involved and gang involved, right? And so anyway, there's some look with that. But anyway, so if you score low and it's a Class B misdemeanor, then you shall be given a non-judicial adjustment. If you score moderate, you still will be given a non-judicial adjustment, except for these certain 5 offenses that are carved out: DUI, criminal homicide, reckless endangerment, possession of a weapon at school, and then possession of a shotgun. So like not only, that's only if like, so you have possession of a weapon at school, and then you also have possession of a weapon, and which is not at school, and possession of a weapon not at school is only referencing if it's a gun. Anyway, so there's some carve outs with regards to that. Now, if the kid scores high risk, then they still can be offered a non-judicial, but it's no longer required. It then becomes discretionary to the probation department. So if they score high risk, the probation department can still say, we're still going to give you a non-judicial, or the probation department can say, no, I'm going to refer it to the prosecuting attorney for the prosecuting attorney to make the determination about whether or not it should be petitioned to go to court, or whether or not we want to send it back and say, yeah, go ahead and offer that kid a non-judicial, right? So I thought that that was one point of clarification that was important in your guys' questions to make sure that, you know, is that the district attorney's office is not screening those, the probation department is screening them.
Can I ask 2 questions about that? Does the student fill out that assessment out, or is it done by the person the student's working with at the probation department, or jointly?
So the student and their parent come in and meet with the probation department, and the kid answers the questions, and then some of the questions are also kind of directed towards the family. It's like a mix of, you know, it's like, you know, and it's the types of questions you would expect. Are there problems at home? Do you have struggle in school? Like, you know, and then you kind of, and then if they do come to court, or if they're petitioned, or if they get high risk, then after there's an adjudication, they do a more in-depth risk assessment to make recommendations about what type of court orders should be made. So there's a follow-up to that assessment.
And you also mentioned it just really quickly in passing about students who have previous offenses. Do they not then, like at a certain threshold, do they not get to do that assessment? They're just sort of put in a different category automatically?
No, so you still continue to do the PRA or the PSRA every time that a kid comes to court, because their risk level changes, right? Like that's a really important thing about the reform work, is that what it showed, and this is why we're looking at all of these issues, right? Is if you took 2 similarly situated kids, and this one got a diversion or a non-judicial, right? Like they were referred to court, they had to meet with the probation officer, but it wasn't a formal petition, kind of protects their record and how they can answer questions about, have you ever had a charge or an allegation, some things like that. And they don't formally see the judge. Or this kid who was petitioned, that the kid who wasn't petitioned to court was less likely to come back. And this kid was more likely to come back at a pretty significant rate. And so the PRA is always looking at that, because it's always looking at the risk level. And of course, the longer and the lengthier that your history becomes, the more your risk level goes up as well, right? So that's something, but the non-judicials are driven by if you've had so many prior non-judicials and they were closed unsuccessfully, then at some point in time, they still could continue to give you a non-judicial. It's just not required. The statute right now says, in these circumstances with low or moderate on these offenses, shall do this. So the other thing that is important with that is that one of the questions that you guys had in there is, can a school resource officer advocate before the judge for a young person? And the answer was no, because there's this automatic $160 fine. And that's not accurate either. So for non-judicials, what happens is they do the PSRA, then the probation. Oh, sorry, were you gonna ask me a question?
Sorry, just from a facilitation point of view, that answer, she's responding, that was in our Salt Lake City PD answers, the first round, not the one we just went through, but the first round. I just saw a few confused faces. So that was one of the responses they gave us in response to one of our questions. So I asked her specifically about that one to clarify. So thanks, Pam. I just wanted to get everybody on the same page. Go ahead.
Yeah. She wanted specifically mentioned, is that the right fine amount? And so what happens is the kid goes to court or goes to see the probation department, you do the risk assessment, and then they decide, okay, we're going to give you a non-judicial agreement. And then they decide what should be the terms of the agreement, right? And so you can get a fine. A fine is not required. And the fine is actually determined by the parent's income at the non-judicial level. And so what happens is the probation officer has the parents fill out like an indigent thing, or basically kind of like a, not already indigent, but like, you know, a salary income type thing. And then they plug the numbers into the court's computer system, which is called CARE. And then care tells them this is what the fine is, and then it also applies a sliding scale to that. And so then it says, okay, now this should be the fine. But most probation officers, at least in the 3rd district, and I think actually statewide, but I know in the 3rd district, have really, particularly in the last couple of years, really been, and especially in the last year, really been pushing and leaning more towards offering community service hours than fines.
Yeah, that's what my follow-up question is. What's the intent of a fine to the parents to modify student behavior? Is it just because that's, I mean, fines are just so entrenched in the system that a fine is just one of the buttons we push?
Yes.
Okay, all right. I just wasn't sure the direct correlation, but that's, but the
I mean,
community service.
No,
is-
I think I
Yeah.
mean, if you go to court, the fine is determined on the kid's ability to pay the fine, but at the non-judicial level, it's based on the parent's ability to pay. And to me, that's a real problem, right? Because if you're in a situation where you have the ability to pay the fine and you're the parent and you're like, look, I don't want Johnny to go do X, Y, and Z. I want him to be responsible or whatever, but I'd rather pay the $100 fine right now today, close the case, and I'd rather go home and deal with Johnny. Just like, basically, like, you know, if you can pay the fine, like, you can close your case that day, right? So it raises the real issue, I mean, being talked about across the board in criminal and juvenile justice reform, right? Which is the fine structure sets up a way for people with means to get out of the court system very quickly, and can be an impediment to families that do not have those same resources. So that's one of the reasons that in juvenile court, they have been looking more towards community service hours, because also, what's the rehabilitative nature of a fine paid by the parent, right? Or based on the parent's income, right? So that is a shift that has been happening. But also what happens is they do ask the kid for their preference. And so, you know, I'm in the interview, if you're with mommy and daddy and you say, and the probation officer says, would you rather do the 8 hours or would you rather pay, you know, the $75 fine? You can imagine. Now, the good thing that happened in reform is that those are no inability to pay the fine. So even if you do a fine and then failure to pay the fine isn't a reason for them to say you didn't, they can't petition it to court off of that, right? So like, you used to be able to get petitioned to court, like you violated the terms of the agreement. So failure to pay or meet a monetary obligation is no longer a way to petition it, but it does show as unsuccessfully closed. So that means if you get in trouble again, it starts to go towards what I was talking about. If you've had so many prior non-judicials that were closed unsuccessfully, then you can't continue to get them offered. So I am rambling. Is any of this information helpful?
This is
Oh, okay.
really helpful. It really is. But I do want to switch us a little bit because our meetings are only an hour. So I want to switch us to make sure everybody has the opportunity to have their questions answered. I have about 50, but I'm going to defer to the group as what questions that you all have for Pam before I jump in with my big mouth. No questions?
See, you guys are an easy group.
All right.
See?
Well, I'll make it harder. So I guess just I'm curious. There are two things. So Pam and I talked to set this up, and there were a couple of things in that conversation that I found really enlightening that I think will inform our work in terms of the group that she's already involved in with juvenile justice reform and some of these bills that are being run do focus pretty heavily on at least my understanding of the conversation is they focus pretty heavily on that and the accountability, like the data collection, the accountability for the list of things that we're going to be on the training that we all looked at, like, oh, we're going to train on this and that and this and that, and looking at all those different things. So I guess I would ask you, are there places where we can focus where we won't be duplicating that effort? My concern is that we're going to make recommendations that either duplicate what the juvenile justice system is already trying to put into place or are contradictory in some way. And not to say they wouldn't be good. I just want to make sure that this group is focusing our effort on change that are going to be unique and not necessarily, oh yeah, great, thanks for those recommendations, and we already recommended those things over here. And so I want to make sure we can be thoughtful there. And then I would just ask you for any, I know you work statewide, so any thoughts that are Salt Lake City specific that you think are unique that this group can tackle, or more positioned to tackle than maybe a statewide group is? Those are my two.
Well, yeah, for sure. Because one, I think the JJOC stuff that we're talking about is really making like 2 word changes to Representative Holland's previous training bill that Mo worked on years ago, right? And then, but the big piece that's different about it is saying, but you've got to the data in Senator Andrigg's bill, like we're tying it to the data collection piece, right? And so I think one thing that, you know, even if that passes, I think the situation is that schools are struggling with how and what to collect, right? So this bill like goes through and outlines you need to be collecting data with regards to race and ethnicity and things like that. But I think also the really important piece to me is because and Mo was at our first meeting with regards to this when we're, like I said, when you're on the spectrum of talking about should we have SROs at all or should we not have SROs, the reality is that there isn't any data. And so it's hard to say in Utah, like if you look at the memo I sent, it's referencing national data, right? So we can look at the school referral stuff that I talked about, and it had from the courts, and the courts do have great data, but even that has some challenges about, is that SRO tied versus school tied? And I think that that's a really important question, is what is SRO facing data and what is school facing data? So schools, I think, should be responsible for showing, for kids who have had disciplinary problems, what have been the alternative approaches that have been offered before engaging in SRO, right? Or even if an SRO is engaged, then did we escalate straight to a referral, or did we do alternative things and then we got to referral because the kid wouldn't comply with the alternatives offered, or whatever the reasoning may be, right? And so I think that that has been a real point of confusion with Senator Andrigg's bill, is between the schools and law enforcement, is who collects which pieces of data. And so to me, really important pieces of data. And like I said, I would look at Senator Andrigg's bill because you might want to add to what's in there, right? But the really important questions to me are what types of making sure that you're gathering the race and ethnicity data stuff, but then also what are the interventions that have been tried? What types of evidence-based alternatives do schools have to offer? As do they have a good firm disciplinary plan in place for, these are the types of behaviors that our school plans to handle through school disciplinary measures, and then these are going to be the school disciplinary measures, and then these are going to be like, you know, and then what are the data points that you want collected around that, right? Because I think what you're going to see in Senator Andrigg's stuff is those things are always at the legislative level, kind of the bare minimum, right? You know, so, but I think another thing, because I think that's a lot of what we're hearing when we're talking about this, is that SROs can have, it's been very interesting to watch over the past 10 years, because originally what you heard a lot of, and Mo knows this because this was part of the training piece, right, is that schools were asking law enforcement officers to act like social workers, right? And to handle the problems in a different capacity. And so it's been kind of trying to figure out like who has what role. When you're talking about Salt Lake City specific issues, I mean, I think what we see in court pretty regularly are trespass cases that are sent without really a lot of alternatives or other things being offered with regards to that. The other issue that was,
what behavior does that usually represent?
what's that?
The trespass stuff, like what's usually happening in those? It doesn't translate in my mind to like, what is the behavior?
So what usually happens is, a lot of what we see with the trespasses is girlfriend comes to boyfriend's school to see boyfriend at lunchtime, and girlfriend's not supposed to be there. So then we cite girlfriend with trespass, you know? And it's like, yeah, or could we just say you need to go to, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not there, you know, but we've seen a lot of those where they're just automatic referrals. I think another one that's a real big question is the drug issue. And I'm not saying one way or the other what to do with it, but like say, take marijuana at school, right? What we used to see with that for a lot of years is you had, and this was pre-adult reform, right? Is you had possession of marijuana and then you had possession of marijuana at school. And so that was a class A. And class A's couldn't be done through diversion. So it depended on, I mean, I'm just gonna be really blunt. It depended on if you were a white or a brown kid, which level of offense you got charged with. And I'm talking 10, 15 years ago, right? Because now we don't have possession at school and what, anyway. And, I think one thing that's really important about those drug offenses, and I know that that's a real problem for schools, I mean, obviously, and for parents, right, to have a kid who brings something like that to school. But one of the things that happens is all of the front end disciplinary behavior happens way at the beginning, right? Like the kid gets expelled, they go to an alternative program, they go through all the steps with regards to that. And then 4 months later, the petition shows up at court and then the family has to go through it all over again. And so to me, those are ones that are really good questions of if it's a first time offense or things like that, is that something that would be appropriate for law enforcement and schools to consider looking at through alternative, like through, I know you guys have peer court and stuff like that. But we do see the trespass issue. I see that the drug offense one, like I said, just because it's so, there's such a, you have to remember there's such a lag time with the courts. And so when you've already had a kid who's, you know, been safe schooled for between 30 and 90 days. The manifestation issue with regards to kids that have an IEP, I think is something that routinely gets missed at court is the behavior and whether or not it's tied to any type of special education need or anything like that. And so I think that is a really important question. I was going to specifically to a question that you asked me, and now I've lost my own head. Where was I? What were you asking me to tell you?
Salt Lake City specific things that we might be able to dig at. And I have a question about your IEP thing. So do you see disparity there as well? Like that students of color maybe don't have the representation or the whatever to help parse that once it gets to the court to say, because I think what I hear you saying is the manifestation issue is there's students who have an IEP and there's behaviors associated with that IEP that have led to this referral or criminal behavior. Am I getting that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so do you see disparity there on students getting deeper into the system if they are lacking in resources or perhaps students of color versus students with resources?
100%.
You do? Okay.
But what I would also say is this is, and I'm just going to warn you guys, and Mo and Nicole already know this, but like I have a knack for offending someone in the room every time I talk. So apologies ahead of time. But what I will say is this, is that I have a son who has an IEP. And what I will say is that we are drastically behind the curve nationally on getting IEP services for young people. And then
Utah, or
if you also look at the situation, I think to your point, yeah, families who have means might handle and deal with the school differently. And that's definitely an issue. But what I will also say is, and I see that Andrew's on the call, and I think that the Disability Law Center has really been trying to get involved and being really raising the issues of special education issues for young people and being a resource for families to go to. But I think Andrew could speak to that there is a real shortage of, I mean, outside the Disability Law Center, there's a real shortage of where families go for that, right? I mean, that's a real problem, is because all of the school disciplinary stuff happens before they ever get to court. So by the time I see them, it's already all happened, right? And you're outside the time frame to challenge the manifestation, which is within the first 10 days, you know, and all that other types of stuff, or have they been missed by an IEP altogether? So there's a lot of things that are happening with regards, and that's where I think it's such an important piece to be looking at through the lens of what are the resources that are most helpful to our kids and helping them succeed educationally, right? So like for our office, we can handle all the legal stuff, right? Like, I mean, hopefully, we're going to look at it this way. And we're going to say, we're going to talk to you about filing this motion, or how do you want to handle this? Or how do you want to handle that? But at the end of the day, we've also got to work with the family about how are they going to comply? Even if the case ultimately gets dismissed, there's orders up front that get made, right? So now we have a social worker. We have actually 2 social workers within our office to help us look at situations like that. So we've done multiple things where we've actually been the ones to write the letter on behalf of the parents to say this kid needs to be screened for an IEP and things like that. But there's a real lack of resources for education advocacy outside of the wonderful Disability Law Center, which is incredible. And Michelle, I've worked with Michelle at the DLC, who's been working on the special ed stuff. But that's a very difficult area for parents to navigate and advocate for themselves. And particularly if you're a family that doesn't speak English, or that doesn't have the means to really, or think about a single mom, right? Like you've got to go to, I mean, the IEP meetings take a lot of time, and you've got to know what to ask and what to say and things like that. And I mean, I'm an attorney who works in juvenile court, and I'll tell you what, I'm scared to death every time I walk into my kid's IEP meeting, because I'm like, are you guys sure that's what we should be doing? So
Yeah. Well,
it's a difficult area.
we only have a few minutes remaining, so I want to make sure, is anybody else have any questions they want to ask? Pam, Dati, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just have a really quick question. So if a student is found intoxicated on campus, what would be the process that they go through? Like, I know that if they're found on campus by the Salt Lake City School District MOU, they can be cuffed, and then they're allowed to stay in a classroom, I think. And then what goes on from there?
If you were to follow that through the system.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so I guess it depends on if they refer it to court. Why are they cuffing them?
It's in the MOU that they're allowed to, and they can,
Yeah.
there's like, we were reading about detaining and write the correct ways to detain and allowed ways to detain in some of the policy documents. I believe that's where that was, in the Salt Lake PD policy documents.
I don't think they're required.
Yeah,
Oh.
I don't think they're required to,
Have to,
but
but
they're
it's
allowed
in
to.
there.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would, along those lines, thank you. Yay, it's not required, but I would encourage you to look at, there's a lot of research on shackling of young people. And we did some work on that statewide several years ago about not being required to shackle every kid that comes into the courtroom from detention, because when you use instruments like that with young people, it has a very significant impact on how they see themselves. And then one thing that we know with young people is that the way they see themselves guides how they then act as well, right? But back to your specific question, it depends, I guess, on whether or not the school resource officer or Salt Lake City PD, if it's a school resource officer, if they decide then whether or not to refer it to court. If they decide to refer it to court, that would be a possession of alcohol or consumption of alcohol ticket. And assuming that they didn't have a history, or that they didn't have a lengthy history, well, either way, it'll go to the probation department. But assuming that they don't have a history or don't have a lengthy history, they would qualify for a non-judicial adjustment. So they would go meet with the probation officer, engage in this informal kind of agreement, like I agree to do X, and in exchange, it won't get sent to the court for a petition. If you have a lengthy history, or there's, like I said, when you go through the risk assessment, the score is such, then it could get petitioned to court, and then you can see the judge.
At what point does the SRO detach, right? Like, so that was kind of the question we had some the PD that we didn't really understand, was like, at what point do they, since they get all this training and they're supposed to know the student and know the environment, and in theory, they have really thought about this referral by the time it goes out, at what point can they not influence the outcome anymore?
they could always influence the outcome.
Throughout,
Uh,
when they're in court, the SRO can appear and things like that at their own discretion.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how as excited as the defense attorney. Well, let me actually clarify that. No, let me think about it. So let's walk that through in a couple of different ways really quickly. But one, the SRO can issue the citation, right? And the citation goes, and I think that this is an important clarification as well, right? The citation goes to probation the way that the officer chooses to write it down, right? Like, is it an assault? Is it a riot? Is it an assault that's been gang and group enhanced? I will tell you that we do see more and more frequently in Salt Lake, and I'm always talking Salt Lake County wide, so I want to be clear with you guys about that, because I would have to pull by a zip code to tell you Salt Lake City specific. But what we are seeing more frequently is fights at school that are getting group enhanced. So assaults where, like, instead of being charged as a party to an offense to the assault, they're in group enhancing it, because as you, like I said, as you go up one level, it impacts the ability to NJ. What I think is a more interesting question is what's getting charged as an assault and what's getting charged as a riot, because a riot is a felony offense. And we did actually pull some data about the riot offense, and the riot offense is highly disproportionately applied to the Latinx kids.
And does that starts with how the SRO chooses to write the ticket?
Yeah.
They have a choice. They could write an assault, or they could write this group enhanced thing that then it takes a different path from there, right?
Right. But then probation could get something, and probation could look at something and be like, well, he wrote this down as an assault, but this kid's in a coma, you know, like, I mean, I think I maybe, and because probation always has the ability to turn to a prosecutor and say, was this properly cited? Right? Like, I want you to review the police report. So there are cases where then they can look at something and say, you know, and there is this, and obviously school resource officers as well as law enforcement in general can always like contact the district attorney's office about a police report and say, I'm struggling with how to write the citation, or like, you know, and they might get guidance with regards to that. But riots are petitioned because they're a felony offense by the prosecutor. But if it's referred a certain way, then it goes a different route, right? And it goes directly to the prosecutor than going through to the probation department. So I think there are some things that impact the way that things, and again, I have nothing to say by data that that's something that people are like, I'm not trying to say that people are like, oh, I can specifically do this and then X happens. I'm just saying these are some of the things that we've seen with data that we've kind of looked at, mainly because my office has kind of asked questions like, hey, we've been starting to see a lot more riot charges. Why is that, right? Now that'd be it's a hard thing to look at, because you'd have to go pull all the assault charges and all the riot charges and then be like, now which ones are charged this way? And, you know, like which ones are similarly situated, but this one got this charge and this one got this charge. So far what we've been able to do is look at it and say, if you look at the riot charges and proportion it to the Latinx population within the area, within our state, it's significantly overrepresented in that offense.
Well, thank you, Pam. We have 4 minutes remaining, and we have another group that meets at 5, and several members of this group like to jump to that one. So I'm always trying to facilitate to as close to 5 o'clock as I can. So I guess I will thank you, Pam, for being here and to giving us all those answers. And I will ask you if you're willing to be a resource in future, should we come to another one of these points where we're like trying to understand where the data meets the reality of that you matriculate in.
Absolutely. I'm happy to help out however, and yeah, whatever you guys need from me, happy to help out. And I want to be clear too, that I have that memo that's looking at national data, and, you know, I do look at things through the lens of a defense attorney, but I also think that these are good conversations, because I think we don't have data in Utah to really tell us, is one answer the right answer? And so I think we got to start with, how do we start to capture that so that we know how we can make better informed decisions?
Yeah, and I really did appreciate that that document, because there were some of the national data. If you haven't read it yet, subcommittee members, please do, because there are some data points in there that speak to some national trends and some things that have been informing this program over time that I found pretty enlightening. And so with that, I will, with the remaining 3 minutes, I will encourage, I don't think we're gonna have time to go through the spreadsheet that has all of the assignments for interviews, but I will ask you to check your conscience and check your email. And if you haven't responded to Coletta or if you weren't here last week to sign up, like we kind of put people's names in the different slots who was willing or interested in interviewing each of the folks. We have created a spreadsheet. It's on the Google Drive. Cindy, can we send another link out to the group just to make sure that we have it? We're going to send the link out again. So if you're willing, Coletta's been sending out, hey, we have this person who's willing to be interviewed at these different times. So please do be responsive to her, because I know from personal experience that those things are really tricky to set up and really tricky to connect people to the available time slots. And that's information that we want. So we'll wait and circle back on those. Next.
Siobhan, on Tierlink and Ashley Fletcher, they came out, but they were it said under training subcommittee, is what the email said.
Oh.
And I'm assuming it was supposed to be for this.
So there was a typo in the email that said greetings training subcommittee. Okay.
Yeah, it says training subcommittee. So just so y'all know that, don't ignore that one. Actually, that's us here. So the dates that they put in, it's really for
Cindy,
the
can we
safety
flag
group.
that one for Coletta and just make
Yeah.
sure?
And they're 2 emails.
Okay.
Yeah.
Two
Thank
separate
you.
emails.
Okay.
And then just real quick, almost a lot of stuff what Pam was talking about. Schools mostly use MTSS, multi-tiered system support. It's a framework to provide services and resources depending on the needs. First, second, third tier. It's really hard to implement, but Salt Lake is one of the ones that say doing it, and there should be data on all that. And I have not been able to get them to have data, whether it's what programs do you have in your school district level or at the school level or whatever level. It's pulling teeth. And so to try to get student misconduct and who refers who and what, that's a big one. So Pam, I didn't realize that they were connecting those two bills together. That's really good. So as we go out across the state, we'll remind people, hey, if you want to be legal, you got to start collecting that data. So thanks.
Moises, would you mind just writing me a 1-line email with that question about that? Because I wonder if we should add that to our question sheet for those who have information about that, the acronym you just said that I'm not going to try and repeat. If we can add that to our questions list, just for those who are familiar with that system, and maybe we can get at least some anecdotal thoughts from people who are familiar with it. Yeah. Okay. And so Moises also has connected us with some other folks in juvenile justice that are going to Moises, we need to talk offline about actually, are they planning on being here next week, or do we need to extend an invite?
So Donovan is not going to be able to make it. He's taking both these times, just so you all know. But he said Trina Dickinson, who's part of 3rd District here in Salt Lake County, and actually Brett Peterson, who's the JJS director, I said that they'd be willing to come next week. So I sent out an invitation already. So
okay,
I'm just waiting to hear back.
So will you just let me know if they accept the invitation so we can get the agenda set? So with that, we've run out of time, but I want to make sure that listening sessions are still being planned for. I wanted to give you a quick update on this call, but I think I will have to do so on email. So please watch for that. And watch for your sort of marching orders on some of that stuff, because we are going to ask you a lot of questions and ask for your help. And I appreciate the thoughts we've already had on that. For the youth subcommittee, can I give you something to talk about on Saturday? How willing are you? We don't have a ton of resources for social media if we want to be independent from the city. They have their social media. We're already going to start a Facebook page just to have a place for things to land, and we have a website. But will you all explore your willingness to go beyond Facebook and extend in some of these other places where we might, either using like some of the things that Dati, you pointed out last week about the West High spam thing, but like either to identify some existing accounts that we can send information through, or if we want to set one up. Dati, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I just found this Instagram account a little bit ago, but West High has like an anonymous account where students can submit their interactions or like racism that they've experienced on campus. And they have like a ton of students who've submitted anonymous things about SROs harassing them and asking them to like dump out their backpack contents like on school grounds and for them to look through them. So I'm wondering that obviously the fact that the students decided to submit their comments anonymously shows me that students are uncomfortable with, you know, attaching their name to their story. So are we allowed to have like an anonymous form where students can submit something?
Yes, so there is a text forum that you kind of go back and forth on text, and that I believe that is optional to leave a name when that gets rolled out. We also will have a phone line that people can call in, and they can also obviously choose to identify themselves or not. So we are trying to be as thoughtful as we can about creating those forums, but we are wide open to your thoughts. If you can think of some other ways to do that, that might be more user friendly or welcome more people to get into them. The other thing we're planning is sort of a do-it-yourself focus group so that those who don't want to interact with a larger group or speak publicly can sort of take and do data collection for this process on their own and submit it to us. So that is forthcoming as well. So we will continue to talk to you about these listening sessions, and I swear we will find time in a meeting to get to it. Maybe they'll talk about it from 5 to 6 and do a better job than I did here, but we will continue on email, and I will send our agenda for next time as it stands is the folks that Moises has invited, if they agree. We have updates on these interviews that we're doing. Hopefully a couple will have been conducted, and we will be able to dial in, talk about the ones that we haven't been able to reach or whatever, make sure we get that information. Dati, maybe we'll put a report back from the youth subcommittee on their willingness to sort of help with the outreach, and then I'll also include the listening sessions update beyond what we send on email this week. So anything else for the good of the order, anything else from this group that we definitely want to get on this next agenda or future agendas before I let you jump to your next? Okay, everybody join me in thanking Pam for her time and for giving us her commitment to help us in the future, which I plan on taking advantage of at some point. So, and I like your, Rogelio's backdrop is very judicial. It feels in keeping with the theme of the day. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Pam. And we will see you all next week. Moises, let me know about our speakers one way or the other. Okay.
Thank you, Pam.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.